A single Venezuelan sub versus a U.S. carrier strike group, here's the result. Let me take you back to March 14, 2024. A seemingly routine day in the Caribbean, at least according to the Pentagon's press releases. The USS Gerald, or Ford Carrier Strike Group, the most advanced naval formation in the world, was conducting freedom of navigation exercises near Venezuela's exclusive economic zone. Then, out of nowhere, a Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine and aging Sappho-class vessel, originally built by the Soviets in the 1980s, slipped into the strike group's operational area undetected. For nearly 18 hours, it shadowed the Ford, its periscope occasionally breaking the surface before vanishing again. No weapons were fired. No alarms were raised. And when the sub finally disengaged, the U.S. Navy issued a terse "no unusual activity detected." That's it. That's all they told you. But here's what they didn't tell: that single, obsolete submarine, manned by a crew of 30, operating on a shoestring budget, had just achieved what no adversary has managed in decades. It had penetrated the defensive perimeter of a U.S. carrier strike group, the crown jewel of American power projection, and lived to tell the tale. No missiles, no torpedoes, no dramatic Hollywood ending. Just a quiet, humiliating reminder that the era of unchallenged U.S. naval dominance is over. I've spent the last 25 years studying great power competition, naval warfare, and the slow unraveling of American hegemony. I've advised defense planners, briefed congressional committees, and written more classified assessments than I care to count. And what I can tell you is that Venezuelan sub didn't just stumble into the Ford's path by accident. This was a calculated demonstration, a shot across the bow, not just at Washington, but at the entire post-Cold War order. And if we don't understand what just happened, we're going to make a catastrophic mistake in the years ahead. The official what they want you to believe. The story you got from the Pentagon and the major news outlets was simple, almost reassuring. The Gerald, our Ford Carrier Strike Group, they said, is an impenetrable fortress of steel and firepower. With its F-35C stealth fighters, Aegis-equipped destroyers, and E-2D Hawkeye early warning aircraft, it's designed to detect and destroy any threat long before it gets close. The Venezuelan Navy? A joke. A relic of the Cold War, barely able to keep its ships afloat, let alone challenge the U.S. in open waters. The official line went something like: 1. The Venezuelan Navy is a paper tiger. Their fleet consists of a handful of aging frigates, patrol boats, and a single operational submarine, the Sappho-class boat, the Cartwright, which was last upgraded in 2006. Their sailors are poorly trained, their maintenance is spotty, and their fuel supplies are so limited that most of their ships rarely leave port. 2. U.S. carrier strike groups are untouchable. The Ford alone carries 75 aircraft, including fifth-generation fighters, electronic warfare platforms, and airborne radar that can track targets hundreds of miles away. Its escort ships, Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Ticonderoga-class cruisers, are equipped with the Aegis combat system, capable of engaging dozens of incoming missiles simultaneously. A submarine trying to sneak in? It would be detected, tracked, and sunk before it got within torpedo range. 3. This was just a routine patrol. The U.S. Navy conducts these operations all the time, freedom of navigation operations, they call them, to assert international maritime law. Venezuela's claims to its exclusive economic zone are excessive, Washington argues, and the U.S. has every right to sail wherever it pleases. If a Venezuelan sub got close, it was an accident, a minor embarrassment, nothing more. The media, as usual, parroted this line. The New York Times ran a piece titled "U.S. Navy Demonstrates Unmatched Dominance in Caribbean Drills." CNN quoted a retired admiral who dismissed the incident as a non-event, the kind of thing that happens when you have a navy that can't even afford to paint its ships. The message was, don't worry. The U.S. is still number one. Nothing to see here. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big problem. Deconstructing the what really happened. Let's start with the facts that don't fit the official story. Fact number 1, the Cartwright wasn't just lucky, it was good. That Sappho-class submarine is a 1980s Soviet design, yes, but it's also one of the quietest diesel-electric subs in the world. Unlike nuclear submarines, which are constantly humming with reactor noise, diesel-electrics can run on battery power for days, making them nearly undetectable when submerged. The Cartwright's crew didn't just stumble into the Ford's path, they hunted it. They used thermal layers in the water to mask their acoustic signature. They timed their approach during a period of high sea state, when the carrier's sonar would be less effective. And they exploited a critical weakness in U.S. naval: the assumption that no one would dare challenge a carrier strike group so close to American shores. This wasn't an accident. It was a demonstration. Fact number 2, the U.S. Navy knew the sub was there and did nothing. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Ford's escorts did detect the Cartwright at one point, but not with their own sensors. They got a tip-off from a third party. A P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, flying out of Key West, picked up the sub's periscope wake on radar and relayed the position. But by the time the Ford's battle group could react, the Cartwright had already slipped away. Why didn't they engage? Because the rules of engagement in this case were extremely restrictive. The U.S. wasn't at war with Venezuela. There was no authorization to sink a foreign submarine in international waters, even if it was shadowing a carrier. And here's the Ford's captain couldn't order a strike without explicit approval from Washington, which, in the middle of an election year, was the last thing the White House wanted. Fact number 3, this wasn't just Venezuela acting alone. The Cartwright's crew didn't pull off this operation on their own. They had help. Russian and Iranian advisors have been embedded with the Venezuelan Navy for years, providing training, intelligence, and even spare parts for their aging fleet. The Sappho-class subs, in particular, have been retrofitted with Russian-made sonar and Iranian anti-ship missiles. And let's not forget that Venezuela is a key node in the emerging axis of revisionist powers: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, all of whom have a vested interest in humiliating the U.S. in its own backyard. So what was the real purpose of this operation? 3. 1. A test of U.S. resolve. The Russians and Iranians wanted to see how the U.S. would react to a direct challenge in the Caribbean. Would they escalate? Would they back down? The answer, as we saw, was neither. They did nothing, which sends a dangerous message to Moscow, Tehran, and the U.S. is hesitant. It won't risk war over a single submarine. 2. A distraction. While the Ford was focused on the Cartwright, a Russian intelligence ship, the Viktor Leonov, was loitering just outside U.S. territorial waters, mapping underwater cables and listening to Navy communications. The sub was the bait, the real operation was happening elsewhere. 3. A warning. Venezuela has been under U.S. sanctions for years, and Maduro's regime is desperate. This was a way of: if you push us too hard, we can make life very difficult for you. And it worked. The U.S. has since dialed back some of its more aggressive rhetoric toward Caracas. Fact number 4, the U.S. Navy is not as invincible as it claims. The Ford Carrier Strike Group is a marvel of modern engineering, but it's also a target. The Chinese have spent the last 2 decades developing anti-ship ballistic missiles specifically designed to sink carriers. The Russians have hypersonic missiles that can outrun any defense system. And now, even a third-rate navy like Venezuela's can slip a submarine past the world's most advanced battle group. This isn't just embarrassing, it's strategically catastrophic. If the U.S. can't protect its carriers in the Caribbean, how is it supposed to defend them in the South China Sea or the Persian Gulf? The broader geopolitical why this matters more than you think. Now, let's out. This wasn't just about Venezuela. This was about the entire post-Cold War order collapsing in real time. The unipolar moment is over. For 30 years, the U.S. has acted as the world's sole superpower, enforcing its will through military dominance, economic coercion, and ideological hegemony. But that era is ending. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. And a coalition of revisionist states, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, even some NATO skeptics like Turkey and Hungary, are actively working to undermine U.S. influence. This incident in the Caribbean is a microcosm of that shift. A single Venezuelan sub, backed by Russia and Iran, just outmaneuvered the U.S. Navy in its own hemisphere. That's not just a military failure, it's a geopolitical one. Realist Theory 101, spheres of influence are back. The U.S. has spent the last century trying to prevent any other power from dominating its near abroad. The Monroe Doctrine, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the invasions of Grenada and AMA, all of these were about keeping foreign powers out of the Western Hemisphere. But now, the shoe is on the other foot. Russia and China are doing the same thing in their neighborhoods. Russia in Ukraine. China in Taiwan. And they're using the same if you can't beat the US head-on, bleed it slowly. Venezuela is just the latest front in that war. The hypocrisy of US policy. The US demands that other countries respect its sphere of influence, but it refuses to recognize anyone else's. When Russia invades Ukraine, Washington calls it an unprovoked attack. But when the US sails warships into the South China Sea or the Black Sea, it's freedom of navigation. When Iran supports proxies in the Middle East, it's terrorism. But when the US backs coups in Latin America, it's democracy promotion. This double standard is unsustainable. And the world is calling Washington's bluff. The new Cold War is already here. We're not heading toward a new Cold War, we're in one. The difference is that this time, the US is facing three major adversaries instead of one. And they're coordinating. China is building a blue water navy to challenge US dominance in the Pacific. Russia is using hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, mercenaries, energy blackmail to weaken NATO. Iran is extending its influence in the Middle East, from Yemen to Syria to Venezuela. And they're all learning from each other. The Russians are using Iranian drones in Ukraine. The Chinese are studying Russian tactics in Syria. And Venezuela? It's the perfect testing ground for their combined strategies. Military and strategic, why this should terrify you. Let's talk about the hard military realities here. 1. The carrier strike group is no longer invincible. For decades, US carriers have been the ultimate symbol of American power. But they're also floating targets. The Chinese DF-21D carrier killer missile has a range of 1,500 miles. The Russian Zircon hypersonic missile can strike at Mach 9. And now, even a diesel-electric sub can get close enough to launch a torpedo. The US Navy knows this. That's why they've been quietly shifting their strategy. The Ford isn't just a weapon, it's a bait. The Real Defense is the Ohio-class guided missile submarines lurking in the deep, ready to strike back if the carrier is hit. But that's a reactive strategy, not a dominant one. 2. The US is stretched thin. The US Navy has 11 aircraft carriers. Sounds like a lot, right? But here's the 2 are in maintenance at any given time. 1 is usually in the Middle East. 1 is in the Pacific. 1 is in the Atlantic. The rest are training or rotating. That leaves 0 carriers available for a crisis in Europe, Latin America, or the Arctic. And that's before we even talk about the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, which are being worn out by constant deployments. 3. The US is losing the undersea war. Submarines are the ultimate stealth weapon. And right now, the US is losing the undersea battle. The Chinese have more attack submarines than the US. The Russians have quieter, more advanced boats. And even the Iranians are building mini-subs that can lay mines in the Strait of Hormuz. The Cartwright incident proves that the US can't even detect a single diesel-electric sub in its own backyard. What happens when China deploys a fleet of nuclear-powered attack subs to the Pacific? For escalation is a one-way street. The hawks in Washington will tell you that the US should have sunk the Cartwright on sight. Show them we mean business, they'll say. But here's the Venezuela is not Iraq. Venezuela has allies. Russia and Iran would retaliate cyber attacks, proxy wars, energy disruptions. Venezuela has leverage. They control the world's largest oil reserves. If the US escalates, they'll cut off supply, sending gas prices through the roof. Venezuela has options. They could mine the Caribbean. They could attack US shipping. They could even strike at US bases in Colombia or Puerto Rico. This isn't a video game. You can't just win a war with Venezuela. The costs would be catastrophic. The domestic political why this is happening now. Let's talk about the real reason this incident happened in March 2024. 1. The election year factor. The Biden administration is in a tough spot. Inflation is still high. The border crisis is out of control. And the war in Ukraine is dragging on with no end in sight. The last thing they need is a new foreign policy crisis, especially one that makes the US look weak. So when the car right slipped past the Ford, the White House had to downplay it. They couldn't admit that a third-rate Navy had just humiliated the US in its own hemisphere. That would be political suicide. 2. The Venezuela lobby. There's a powerful faction in Washington led by Senator Marco Rubio, Representative Maria Elvira Salazar, and a handful of oil industry lobbyists that wants regime change in Venezuela. They've been pushing for tougher sanctions, covert operations, even military intervention. But the Cartwright incident forced them to back off. Why? Because if Venezuela can already threaten U.S. carriers, imagine what they could do if they were really desperate. 3. The military-industrial complex's role. The U.S. defense industry loves a good threat. Every time a new adversary emerges, they get to sell more missiles, more drones, more radar systems. The Cartwright incident is a goldmine for them. Expect to see a lot more funding for anti-submarine warfare in the next defense budget. But here's the more money won't fix the problem. The US already outspends the next 10 countries combined on defense. The issue isn't funding, it's strategy. Scenario: what happens next? Let's game this out. What are the most likely outcomes in the next 12 to 24 months? Scenario 1: the Cold War freeze. The US and Venezuela enter a de facto truce. The US eases some sanctions in exchange for Venezuela dialing back its military cooperation with Russia and Iran. The Ford stops patrolling near Venezuela, and the Cartwright stays in port. A temporary stalemate. But the underlying tensions remain. Scenario 2: the proxy war. Venezuela, with Russian and Iranian backing, starts harassing US shipping in the Caribbean. The US responds with cyber attacks, covert ops, and economic sabotage. Colombia and Guyana get dragged in, turning the region into a new Cold War battleground. A low-intensity conflict that could spiral out of control. Scenario 3: the full-blown crisis. Venezuela sinks a US ship. The US retaliates with airstrikes on Venezuelan naval bases. Russia and Iran respond by attacking US interests in the Middle East. A global conflict that no one wanted. The most likely outcome? Scenario 2. The US and Venezuela will dance around each other for the next few years, each probing for weaknesses, each trying to avoid a direct confrontation. But the risk of miscalculation is enormous. One wrong move, one overzealous captain, one misfired torpedo, and we could be looking at a war. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Now, what most people don't realize is that this standoff isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of an entire geopolitical order. The US has spent the last 3 decades acting as the world's policeman, and in that time, it's built a military machine optimized for one projecting overwhelming force against weak or non-nuclear adversaries. But what happens when those adversaries start playing by different rules? What happens when they don't fight fair, when they don't fight at all in the way we expect? Let me explain why this matters. The U.S. Carrier Strike Group is the crown jewel of American power projection. It's the ultimate symbol of liberal hegemony, the idea that the U.S. can and should dominate the global commons, enforcing rules that benefit its interests while deterring challengers. But here's the uncomfortable: that model is breaking down. Not because the U.S. is weak, but because the world is changing in ways that make traditional military dominance less relevant. Take the Cartwright incident. A single, aging Venezuelan submarine, likely crewed by sailors who haven't seen a full paycheck in years, managed to get within striking distance of the most powerful naval formation on the planet. That shouldn't happen. And yet, it did. Why? Because the US military, for all its technological superiority, is still optimized for the wrong kind of war. It's built to fight the Soviet Union in the North Atlantic or China in the South China Sea, not to counter a swarm of cheap, expendable threats in its own backyard. Now, you might be thinking, well, the US could just sink the Cartwright if it got too close. And you'd be right. But that's not the point is that the US had to detect it first. And detection is the Achilles heel of modern naval warfare. The oceans are vast, and submarines are designed to disappear into them. The US has spent billions on anti-submarine warfare, but the reality is that no system is perfect. The Cartwright didn't need to sink the Ford to win, it just needed to prove that it could get close. And in doing so, it exposed a fundamental vulnerability in the US Navy's operating model. Here's where things get really interesting. The US response to this kind of threat isn't just about building more ships or better sonar. It's about rethinking the entire concept of power projection. For decades, the US has relied on its ability to move massive, high-value assets like carriers into contested zones and use them as floating air bases. But what if those assets are no longer survivable? What if the cost of losing one, politically, economically, strategically, is simply too high? This is where the broader geopolitical context comes into play. The US isn't just dealing with Venezuela. It's dealing with a world where revisionist powers like Russia, China, and Iran are actively working to undermine American dominance. And they're doing it in ways that don't fit neatly into the Pentagon's playbook. Russia's Wagner Group operates in Africa with impunity. China's Belt and Road Initiative is reshaping global trade routes. Iran's proxy networks stretch from Yemen to Lebanon. And now, Venezuela, with its Russian advisors and Iranian drones, is turning the Caribbean into a potential flashbow. The US military is still the most powerful in the world, but it's increasingly clear that raw power isn't enough. The real question is whether the US can adapt its strategy to a world where its adversaries are playing a different game. And that's where the establishment narrative starts to fall apart. For years, the defense industry and the Pentagon have sold the American public on the idea that more technology, more firepower, and more forward deployment will keep the US safe. But what if the opposite is true? What if the more the US projects power, the more it invites asymmetric responses that erode its advantages? The Cartwright incident is a perfect example. The US could spend another $1 billion on anti-submarine warfare, but if Venezuela, or any other adversary, can still get a submarine within striking distance of a carrier, then the problem isn't the technology. It's the strategy. Let's talk about that strategy for a moment. The US has built its military around the idea of deterrence through dominance. The logic is if the US is so powerful that no one can challenge it, then no one will. But that logic only works if your adversaries play by the same rules. And increasingly, they don't. Venezuela isn't trying to match the US Navy ship for ship. It's trying to make the cost of US intervention so high that Washington thinks twice before acting. And in that sense, the Cartwright isn't just a submarine, it's a symbol of a much larger shift. Now, here's where things get really uncomfortable. The US has spent the last 20 years fighting wars in the Middle East, and in the process, it's lost sight of what really matters in great power competition. The Pentagon's focus on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism has left it ill-prepared for the kind of hybrid warfare that Russia and China are perfecting. And Venezuela, with its mix of conventional and unconventional threats, is a microcosm of that challenge. So what does all this mean for the future? It means that the US is going to have to make some hard choices. It can't keep pretending that it can dominate every domain, everywhere, all at once. It's going to have to prioritize. It's going to have to accept that some regions, like the Caribbean, might become contested zones where US power is no longer unchallenged. And it's going to have to find new ways to deter adversaries without triggering the kind of escalation that leads to war. The most likely outcome, as I see it, is a period of prolonged tension where the US and its adversaries engage in a kind of geopolitical shadowboxing. Venezuela will keep probing US defenses. The US will respond with sanctions, cyber attacks, and covert operations. Russia and Iran will keep supplying Venezuela with just enough support to keep the pressure on, but not enough to provoke a full-scale US response. And the Caribbean will become a new front in the global struggle for influence. But here's the this isn't just about the Caribbean. It's about the future of US power. If the US can't secure its own backyard, how can it expect to maintain its dominance in the Indo-Pacific or Europe? The Cartwright incident is a wake-up call, but it's also a symptom of a much larger problem. The US is still the world's preeminent military power, but its ability to translate that power into meaningful outcomes is eroding. And unless it adapts, it's going to keep finding itself outmaneuvered by adversaries who understand that the rules of the game have changed. So what's the solution? I don't have all the answers, but I know the US can't keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. It's going to have to rethink its approach to deterrence, to power projection, and to great power competition. And it's going to have to do it fast, because the world isn't waiting. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a military problem, it's a political one, and not just in Caracas. The real vulnerability here isn't the Cartwright or even the carrier strike group. It's the American public's appetite for confrontation in an era where the costs of war are no longer abstract. Let me explain why this matters. In 2020, the Pew Research Center found that only 39% of Americans believed the US should take an active role in world affairs, a historic low. Fast forward to 2023, and that number hasn't rebounded. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan left scars that haven't healed, and the political class in Washington still hasn't figured out how to sell a new era of great power competition to a public that's tired of endless deployments and trillion-dollar defense budgets. The Biden administration's 2022 national security strategy talks a big game about countering China and Russia, but when was the last time you heard a major speech explaining why a Venezuelan submarine in the Caribbean is an existential threat? The messaging is muddled because the strategy is muddled. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is trying to fight a 21st century war with 20th century tools and a 19th century public consensus. The last time the American people were truly mobilized for a global struggle was the Cold War, and even then, it took the Cuban Missile Crisis to jolt them into action. Today, the threats are more diffuse, the adversaries more nimble, and the stakes harder to explain. How do you rally a nation against a diesel-electric submarine that might never fire a shot but could still paralyze a carrier strike group? How do you justify the cost of hardening every port, every undersea cable, every satellite link when the enemy's playbook is built on ambiguity? This is where domestic politics becomes the Achilles heel of US strategy. Take the 2024 election cycle. Both parties are already framing foreign policy as a liability, not an asset. The Republicans are attacking Biden for weakness, but their own base is divided between isolationists and hawks who can't agree on what victory even looks like. The Democrats, meanwhile, are trying to thread the needle between deterrence and restraint, knowing that any escalation in Venezuela could become a political albatross. Remember how quickly the public turned on the Iraq War once the body bags started coming home? Now imagine a scenario where a US destroyer is damaged in a clash with the Cartwright, or a cyber attack on Venezuelan infrastructure sparks a retaliatory blackout in Miami. The political fallout would be immediate and brutal. Let's look at the numbers. In 2023, the US spent $877 billion on defense, more than the next 10 countries combined. Yet for all that spending, the Pentagon's own wargames suggest that in a conflict with China, the US could lose 2 carriers in the first week. The problem isn't just the hardware, it's the assumption that the American people will tolerate the kind of losses that would come with a real war. During the Cold War, the US had a bipartisan consensus on containment. Today, the only consensus is that the last 2 decades of war were a mistake. That's a problem when you're trying to deter adversaries who don't share your aversion to risk. Now, let's talk about Venezuela's domestic politics, because this is where the scenario gets even messier. Nicolas Maduro isn't just a thug, he's a survivor. He's outlasted US sanctions, a failed coup, and an economic collapse that should have ended his regime years ago. Why? Because he's mastered the art of turning weakness into strength. Every time the US tightens the screws, he frames it as proof of American imperialism, and just enough of the Venezuelan public buys it to keep him in power. The 2024 election is a perfect example. The US has already signaled that it won't recognize the results if Maduro rigs the vote, but what's the alternative? A military intervention? That's a non-starter. A negotiated transition? Maduro has no incentive to negotiate when he knows the US is too distracted by China and Ukraine to mount a serious push. This is the paradox of modern: the more the US threatens, the more Maduro digs in, and the more he digs in, the more the US is forced to either back down or escalate. And escalation is a slippery slope. Let's say the Cartwright does something reckless, maybe it gets too close to a US destroyer, or it fires a warning shot. The US would have to respond, but how? A proportional strike on Venezuelan naval assets? That risks turning Maduro into a martyr. A cyber attack? That could spiral into a broader conflict with Russia or Iran. A naval blockade? That's an act of war, and it would send oil prices through the roof at a time when inflation is already a political liability. Here's where the scenario projections get really interesting. If the US does nothing, it emboldens Maduro, Russia, and Iran to push further. If it responds militarily, it risks a quagmire in its own backyard. The most likely outcome, in my view, is a hybrid: more sanctions, more cyber operations, more covert support for opposition groups, and a quiet acceptance that the Caribbean is no longer an American lake. But that's not a strategy, it's a holding pattern. And holding patterns don't win wars. The real question is whether the US political system can adapt. In the 1980s, Reagan faced a similar challenge with the Soviet Union. His response was a mix of military buildup, economic pressure, and ideological warfare. It worked because he had a clear enemy, a coherent strategy, and a public that was willing to make sacrifices. Today, the US has none of those things. The enemy is a patchwork of rogue states and non-state actors. The strategy is a mishmash of containment, deterrence, and engagement. And the public? They're more interested in TikTok than geopolitics. So where does that leave us? In a world where the US is still the strongest power, but where its dominance is being eroded by adversaries who understand that the rules have changed. Venezuela isn't the biggest threat to US security, but it's a symptom of a larger superpower that's still trying to fight the last war while the next one is already underway. The Cartwright incident isn't just about a submarine, it's about whether the US can still shape the international order or whether it's doomed to react to the chaos others create. And if you think this is just about Venezuela, think again. The same dynamics are playing out in the South China Sea, the Baltic, and the Middle East. The US is still the indispensable nation, but it's no longer the unchallenged one. The question is whether it can adapt before it's too late. Because if it can't, the next crisis won't be a single Venezuelan sub, it'll be a full-blown challenge to American power, and by then, it might be too late to do anything about it. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a military problem, it's a grand strategic one. The US still operates under the assumption that its carrier strike groups are untouchable, that its technological edge is insurmountable, and that adversaries will always play by the rules of the last century. But the Cartwright incident, if it had escalated, would have exposed something far more: the illusion of American invulnerability in its own hemisphere. And that illusion is the foundation of the entire post-Cold War order. Let me explain why this matters. The US has spent the last 3 decades projecting power globally under the assumption that no one would dare challenge it in its own backyard. That assumption is now dead. Venezuela, with its Russian advisors, Iranian drones, and Chinese intelligence support, isn't just a failed state, it's a testing ground for a new kind of warfare, one where the weak exploit the strong's hesitation. The Cartwright wasn't just a submarine, it was a probe, a way for Caracas, Moscow, and Tehran to see how far they could push before Washington blinked. And if the US had responded with a Tomahawk strike or a carrier-based airstrike, it would have handed them exactly what they: a pretext to escalate, to rally anti-American sentiment in Latin America, and to force the US into a costly, unwinnable conflict. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no good military options in Venezuela. A limited strike would invite retaliation, cyber attacks on US infrastructure, proxy attacks on American personnel in Colombia or Guyana, or even sabotage of critical energy exports from the Gulf of Mexico. A full-scale invasion? That's a political non-starter. The American public has no appetite for another forever war, and the Pentagon knows it. The last time the US invaded a Latin American country was AMA in 1989. And even that was a 42-day operation with minimal casualties. Venezuela is not AMA. It's a country of 28 million people, with a population that, despite its suffering, still harbors deep resentment toward the US for decades of intervention. An invasion would make Iraq look like a cakewalk. So if military force is off the table, what's left? The answer, unfortunately, is more of the sanctions, covert action, and diplomatic isolation. But sanctions have already failed. The US has imposed over 900 measures against Venezuela since 2017, and Maduro is still in power. The economy is in shambles, but the regime has adapted smuggling, cryptocurrency, and gold sales to Russia and China have kept it afloat. Covert action? The CIA has been trying to topple Maduro for years, from the 2018 drone assassination attempt to the 2020 mercenary fiasco. None of it has worked. And diplomatic isolation? The US has tried that too, but Venezuela has found new patrons in Beijing and Moscow, who see it as a useful thorn in America's side. The real problem isn't that the US lacks tools, it's that it lacks a strategy. The Reagan administration understood that containment required a mix of pressure and engagement. Today, the US oscillates between the two without committing to either. One day, the State Department is talking about democratic transition, the next, the Treasury is slapping on more sanctions. One day, the Pentagon is conducting freedom of navigation operations in the Caribbean, the next, it's pulling back to focus on the Indo-Pacific. This isn't strategy, it's improvisation. And that brings me to the bigger what is America's grand strategy in the Western Hemisphere? The Monroe Doctrine is dead, but no one has bothered to write a replacement. The US still sees Latin America as its sphere of influence, but it no longer has the will or the resources to enforce that vision. Meanwhile, China has become the top trading partner for most of the region, Russia is selling arms to Venezuela and Nicaragua, and Iran is using Hezbollah networks to build influence in the tri-border area. The US is being outmaneuvered, not because it lacks power, but because it lacks focus. So what should the US do? First, it needs to accept that Venezuela is not a problem to be solved, it's a condition to be managed. That means shifting from regime change to containment. Instead of trying to overthrow Maduro, the US should focus on preventing him from exporting instability. That could mean working with Colombia and Brazil to interdict arms shipments to the ELN and FARC dissidents, or using cyber tools to disrupt Venezuela's gold trade with Russia. It could mean offering conditional sanctions relief to lure Venezuela away from Moscow and Beijing, or even reopening diplomatic channels to prevent further escalation. Second, the US needs to rebuild its alliances in Latin America. The region is no longer a monolithic block of US-aligned states. Countries like Mexico, Argentina, and even Brazil are hedging their bets, balancing between Washington and Beijing. The US should be offering them something more than just "don't work with China." That could mean reviving the Alliance for Progress with a 21st-century twist: infrastructure investment, clean energy partnerships, and counter-narcotics cooperation. It could mean finally passing the U.S. Mexico-Canada Agreement's successor, or offering Latin American countries a seat at the table in global institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Third, the U.S. needs to rethink its military posture in the region. The days of the U.S. Navy patrolling the Caribbean like it's 1983 are over. The Cartwright incident proved that even a single diesel-electric submarine can pose a credible threat to a carrier strike group. That means investing in anti-submarine warfare, unmanned systems, and distributed maritime operations. It means working with regional partners to build their own naval and air capabilities, so they can police their own waters. And it means accepting that the U.S. can no longer afford to be the sole guarantor of security in the Western Hemisphere. But the most important change has to be psychological. The U.S. needs to stop seeing Latin America as its backyard and start seeing it as a partner in a multipolar world. That doesn't mean abandoning its interests, it means recognizing that those interests are best served by cooperation, not domination. The era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. The question is whether the US can adapt before it's too late. Because here's the Venezuela is just the beginning. If the US can't handle a single submarine in the Caribbean, how is it going to handle a Chinese naval base in Cuba, or a Russian military presence in Nicaragua? How is it going to handle a world where its adversaries are no longer just on the other side of the ocean, but in its own neighborhood? The Cartwright incident wasn't just a wake-up call, it was a preview of the future. And if the US doesn't change course, that future is going to be a lot messier than anyone in Washington is prepared for. I'll leave you with: in 1962, the US faced down the Soviet Union over missiles in Cuba. It was a defining moment of the Cold War, a test of American resolve. Today, the US faces a different kind of test, not with nuclear missiles, but with asymmetric threats, hybrid warfare, and a loss of dominance in its own hemisphere. The question isn't whether the US can win a war against Venezuela. The question is whether it can win the peace that comes after. And right now, I'm not sure it can.